There is a version of grief you've never heard named out loud. Not the grief that makes you cry. Not the grief that makes you cancel plans and stare at the ceiling. The other kind. The kind where you wake up one morning and realize you don't know who you are anymore, and you're not sure you want to find out. That's what no one warns you about. The loss beneath the loss. You lost the person, or the relationship, or the future you had mapped out in your head. But somewhere in the wreckage, you also lost yourself, your sense of direction, the story you used to tell about who you were and where you were going. And now you move through your days like someone living in a house after a fire. The structure is still standing, but everything inside is ash. Most people call this falling apart. Kübler-Ross would call it something else entirely. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross spent decades sitting with dying patients, not theorizing about death from a distance, but holding its hand. What she discovered in those rooms changed how the world understands loss. And the most important thing she found wasn't about death at all. It was about what happens to the living when they refuse to let grief do what grief is designed to do. Here is the thing you've been getting wrong. Grief is not the enemy. Resistance to grief is. You've been treating your pain like a problem to solve. Something to get through, get over, or at least get better at hiding. And underneath that, there's a fear so specific it probably hasn't fully formed into words yet. If you let go of the pain, you lose the last connection you have to what you lost. So you hold on, not because you want to suffer, because suffering feels like loyalty. Kübler-Ross watched this happen over and over. The people who fell apart weren't the ones who felt the most. They were the ones who refused to move through what they felt, who either buried it or turned it into a permanent address. Grief is not something you survive by enduring it. It's something you survive by letting it reorganize you. What that reorganization looks like, and what gets in the way of it, is exactly what we're going to examine. Because the question isn't whether you'll get through this. The question is who you'll be when you do. Healing feels like betrayal. That's not a metaphor. That's the exact thought running underneath everything you do and don't do right now. You don't say it out loud, but it's there every time you laugh at something and then feel the guilt hit a second later. Every time someone tells you you're doing better and something inside you recoils. Every time you catch yourself thinking about the future and immediately pull back, as if wanting a future is an insult to what you lost. This is the lie grief tells you in its most seductive voice, that your pain is proof of your love, that the depth of your suffering is a measure of how much they mattered, and therefore, if the suffering diminishes, so does the love. Kübler-Ross saw this pattern more than almost any other, not in people who grieved too little, but in people who had quietly decided that grieving forever was the only morally acceptable response to their loss. They weren't weak. They were, in their own way, devoted. They had built a theology of suffering, a private religion where pain was the only acceptable prayer. The problem is what that theology does to you over time. When you make loyalty the reason to stay in pain, pain stops being something you're moving through and becomes something you're living inside. It stops being a response to loss and becomes your entire identity. You are no longer someone who lost something. You are the loss. And that shift, subtle as it is the difference between grief that heals and grief that consumes. Here's the question Kübler-Ross would ask you directly. Does the person you lost, or the life you lost, or the version of yourself you lost, does it actually want this from you? Does it want you frozen? Does it want you to treat joy like a crime? Most people, when they sit with that question honestly, already know the answer. They've always known. The lie isn't that you love deeply. The lie is that destroying yourself proves it. And until you see that distinction clearly, grief will keep asking for more. More sacrifice, more withdrawal, more years, and call it devotion. In the next part, we go inside the actual structure of grief. The 5 waves Kübler-Ross mapped across decades of clinical work, and look at exactly where and why people get stuck. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Grief is not a straight line. You already know this, but you've probably been punishing yourself as if it were. You think you're supposed to move through stages, cry, get angry, bargain with the universe, feel the full weight of it, and then arrive at acceptance like a destination with a welcome sign. That's not how it works. That has never been how it works. And Kübler-Ross never said it was, though almost everyone misread her that way. The stages weren't a ladder. They were a map of the emotional territory loss opens up inside you. Territory you don't cross once and leave behind. Territory you live in, move through, return to, and gradually learn to navigate. What she actually mapped were waves: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Not a checklist, but a weather system. And each one deserves more than a label. Denial is not stupidity. It is your psyche buying itself time. When a loss is too large to absorb all at once, the mind instinctively buffers it. This isn't real. This can't be permanent. There must be a mistake. This is not weakness. This is your nervous system protecting you from a magnitude of pain it cannot process in a single moment. The problem comes only when denial becomes a long-term lease, when you stop using it as a buffer and start using it as a home. Anger is not cruelty. It is the natural response of a person who had something taken from them that they did not choose to give. Anger at the person who died. Anger at the doctors. Anger at God, at the universe, at yourself. Anger even at the person who left. Because abandonment and death can feel indistinguishable in the body. Kübler-Ross was insistent on this. Anger in grief is not a moral failure. It is evidence that what you lost actually mattered. The danger is when it calcifies into a permanent posture. When you carry it so long it stops being grief and starts being your personality. Bargaining is the mind's desperate attempt to recover control over something irreversible. If I had done this differently, if I had called sooner, if I hadn't said what I said. It loops, it obsesses, it rewrites the past in search of a lever that doesn't exist. This is not irrational. It is the psyche's refusal to accept powerlessness. But staying in bargaining indefinitely means staying in a version of events that never happened, trying to fix a past that is already fixed. Depression, in Kübler-Ross's framework, is not dysfunction. It is the moment when reality finally penetrates completely, when the mind stops negotiating and starts absorbing. The fog, the weight, the inability to imagine a future. This is not breakdown. This is the cost of letting the truth in. It is, in a strange way, the most honest phase, because it is the first one that stops arguing with what happened. And acceptance, the most misunderstood of all, is not peace. It is not happiness. It is not moving on. Acceptance is simply the moment you stop fighting reality. Not because the loss is okay, not because the pain is gone, but because you have finally, fully acknowledged that what happened happened, and that your life must now be built around that fact rather than against it. None of these phases arrive in order. You can wake up in acceptance on a Tuesday and be back in bargaining by Thursday afternoon. You can feel 3 of them before noon. The movement is not linear. It is tidal, and that is not failure. That is exactly how the process is supposed to work. The real problem isn't which wave you're in. It's when you stop moving altogether. There are 2 ways grief becomes a trap. The first is suppression, skipping straight to forced acceptance, telling yourself and everyone around you that you're fine, that you've processed it, that you've moved on. You haven't moved on. You've driven the grief underground, where it will wait, patient and intact, and surface years later as rage you can't explain, numbness you can't shake, or a relationship you sabotage for reasons you don't understand. The second trap is permanent residence. You find one phase, usually anger or depression, and you stop cycling. It becomes your resting state. You stop experiencing grief as something moving through you and start experiencing it as something you are. The wave doesn't recede. It just becomes the water you live in. Here's something concrete Kübler-Ross's framework gives you. When the pain hits, whatever form it takes, ask yourself one question. Is this moving, or is this static? Grief that is working feels like waves. It comes, it overwhelms, and it recedes, even slightly, even slowly. Grief that has become identity feels like weather that never changes. Same texture, same weight. Every single day, no movement in any direction. If it's moving, let it move. Don't interrupt it. Don't schedule it or apologize for it or manage it into something more socially acceptable. Let the wave come and let it pass. If it's static, if you've been in the same emotional room for months with no shift whatsoever, that is not grief doing its work. That is grief that has been interrupted. And interrupted grief doesn't disappear. It calcifies. What calcified grief actually looks like, and how to recognize which version of it has taken hold of you, is exactly where we're going next. There is a point, and it arrives quietly, without announcement, where grief stops being something you're carrying and becomes something you are. You don't decide this happens. It happens through repetition, through the slow accumulation of days where the loss is the first thing you think about when you wake up and the last thing you think about before you sleep, through conversations that always find their way back to the same wound, through the gradual withdrawal from everything that doesn't somehow relate to what you lost. And then one day, without ever having chosen it, you realize that grief has stopped being a response to your life and started being the organizing principle of it. Kübler-Ross identified several distinct patterns in how this happens. They look different on the surface. Underneath, they are all doing the same thing, replacing a self that was destabilized by loss with a new self built entirely around it. The first pattern is the most visible. Total identification with pain as identity. You become, in your own mind and in your relationships, the person who lost someone. Every conversation eventually returns to it. Every decision is filtered through it. Years pass, but you remain emotionally frozen at the moment of loss. Not because time hasn't moved, but because you haven't allowed yourself to move with it. The loss hasn't been integrated into your story. It has become your story, the entirety of it. And this is the trap, because as long as grief is your identity, healing feels like self-erasure. The second pattern is its opposite in appearance, identical in function, total avoidance. You don't talk about what you lost. You don't visit the places connected to it. You've reorganized your entire life around not being reminded. New routines, new environments, sometimes entirely new social circles. You tell yourself, this is strength. It isn't. Avoidance doesn't process grief. It suspends it. The pain doesn't integrate. It remains preserved, untouched, exactly as raw as the day you sealed it away. And meanwhile, you live under a quiet dictatorship, your entire existence shaped by what you're constantly working not to feel. The third pattern is one Kübler-Ross observed with particular frequency among those grieving a death: the paralysis of guilt. I don't deserve to be happy when they're gone. If I laugh, I'm forgetting them. Moving forward means leaving them behind. This is not love. This is a hostage situation, where you have imprisoned yourself inside a logic that demands perpetual suffering as the price of loyalty. And the cruelty of it is that you built the prison yourself, with the best possible intentions, and now you can't see the walls because you've been inside them so long. The fourth pattern is emotional anesthesia. After the initial intensity of acute grief, some people don't identify with the pain. They simply stop feeling. Not just sadness, everything. The capacity for joy, for connection, for genuine presence with other people. What looks from the outside like recovery is actually a kind of emotional shutdown, the psyche protecting itself by severing access to feeling altogether. You function, you show up, but you are not there. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to find your way back. The fifth pattern is compulsive substitution. Immediately after the loss, you move to replace it. A new relationship before the last one has been grieved. A new career before you've processed losing the old one. A new version of the exact thing you lost. This isn't recovery. It's denial with momentum. You haven't accepted that the loss is irreversible. You're trying to prove that it isn't, by recreating what's gone close enough to pretend it never left. Here is the practical question. Kübler-Ross's framework demands you ask yourself honestly, which of these is yours? Not which one sounds vaguely familiar. Which one, when you read it, made something tighten in your chest? Which one do you recognize not as a description of other people, but as a description of your Tuesday, your last conversation, the way you spent last weekend, because you cannot navigate out of a pattern you refuse to name? The first concrete thing grief asks of you is honesty. Not courage, not readiness, not having the right support system in place. Just the willingness to look at what you're actually doing and call it what it is. That's the beginning of movement. And movement, however slow, however partial, is what the next part is entirely about. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most advice about grief tells you to feel your feelings. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Because the problem was never that you weren't feeling. It's that you didn't know what to do while you were feeling it. There's a difference between being submerged and learning to swim in deep water. Kübler-Ross spent decades watching that difference play out in real human lives. What she found wasn't a technique for eliminating pain. It was a set of practices for moving through it without losing yourself in the process. The first thing she would tell you is this: allow the wave, but don't become the ocean. Grief comes in surges, not constantly, in waves. There will be moments of genuine respite, moments where you feel almost normal, and then the wave returns without warning. Most people respond to this by either fighting the wave when it comes or dreading the next one during the calm. Both responses keep you in a state of permanent bracing. The practice Kübler-Ross points toward is simpler and harder than either. When the wave comes, let it come completely. Don't manage it. Don't shrink it into something more socially acceptable. Cry if you need to cry. Sit on the floor if that's where your body takes you. Give the wave its full duration, which is almost always shorter than you fear, rarely more than 20 or 30 minutes of genuine intensity. And then let it recede. You don't have to chase it out. You don't have to hold it in. You just have to stop fighting the tide. The second practice is one of the most counterintuitive things Kübler-Ross observed. Grief needs ritual, not avoidance. The instinct when something is painful is to move away from it, to not look at the photographs, to avoid the street where you used to walk together, to change the subject when someone brings them up. This feels like self-protection. What it actually does is keep the pain unprocessed, preserved in amber, untouched by time, as raw the 100th time you accidentally encounter it as the first. Ritual does the opposite. It creates a structured, intentional encounter with the loss. On your terms, in a context you've chosen. Light a candle on the anniversary. Write a letter to the person you lost, or to the version of your life that's gone. Revisit the memories consciously, deliberately, not because it won't hurt, but because conscious pain moves, while avoided pain doesn't. The grief you face directly becomes grief you can integrate. The grief you keep running from stays exactly where you left it. The third practice involves something Kübler-Ross returned to repeatedly in her later work, what she called continuing bonds. For a long time, the dominant assumption in psychology was that healthy grieving meant detachment, severing the emotional connection to what was lost in order to move on. Kübler-Ross challenged this directly. You don't have to let go completely. You are allowed to maintain an internal relationship with what you've lost, to carry the person with you, to consult them mentally, to feel their presence as a real and ongoing part of who you are. The distinction she drew was precise. A continuing bond is healthy when it supports your present life. It becomes unhealthy when it paralyzes it. Talking to your mother in your head as you make decisions is a form of love. Refusing to make any decisions because she's not physically there to make them with you is a form of captivity. The bond itself isn't the problem. What you do with it is. The fourth practice is the one people resist most. Maintain the structure of living, even when living feels pointless. Kübler-Ross observed consistently that the people who lost themselves most completely in grief were those who abandoned basic structure entirely, who stopped sleeping at regular hours, stopped eating with any intention, stopped moving their bodies, stopped maintaining even the minimal routines that give a day shape. This isn't about being strong, it's about understanding what the self needs to remain coherent when its emotional anchors have collapsed. Sleep at roughly the same time, eat something, go outside. Not because these things will fix the grief, they won't, but because your sense of self is partly physical, partly habitual, partly constructed through the small, repeated acts of daily life. When all of those collapse simultaneously, the self doesn't just grieve, it dissolves. The routines aren't a cure, they're a container, something to hold the shape of you while the interior rebuilds itself. The fifth practice is the one that requires the most honesty. Learn to distinguish between honoring what you lost and imprisoning yourself in it. You can carry someone with you and still live fully. These are not mutually exclusive, and Kübler-Ross was explicit about this. Honoring looks like keeping their memory alive in how you live, applying what you learned from the relationship, feeling their influence in your values and choices. Imprisonment looks like treating joy as a betrayal, refusing any future that doesn't include them, measuring your love by the size of your sacrifice. Ask yourself, and ask it honestly, whether the person you lost or the life you lost would recognize your suffering as a tribute, or whether, if they could see you clearly, they would ask you to stop. None of this is easy. Kübler-Ross never claimed it was. But there is a crucial difference between grief that is difficult and grief that is directionless. Difficulty is unavoidable. Directionlessness is a choice, usually an unconscious one, but a choice nonetheless. The direction, when you're ready to take it, points towards something Kübler-Ross identified that most people find almost impossible to accept. You are not going to return to who you were. And that is not the tragedy it sounds like. That's exactly where we're going next. You are waiting to go back to normal. That's the hidden agenda underneath everything. The real reason you keep measuring your grief against some imagined finish line. You want the version of yourself that existed before the loss. And that desire, as human as it is, may be prolonging your suffering more than the loss itself. Kübler-Ross was unambiguous. The self that existed before a significant loss does not come back. Not because grief breaks you permanently, but because loss is not a subtraction. It is a transformation. The person you were was built, in part, around what you no longer have. When that disappears, the architecture of your identity has to change. You don't return to a previous blueprint. You build something new from what remains. The alternative to building is suspension. You've seen it. People frozen at the moment of their loss, living years later as if it just happened, because they never allowed the self to reorganize. They are not more loyal. They are not honoring the loss more purely. They are simply stuck, caught between a self that no longer exists and a new one they've refused to become. Integration doesn't mean the loss stops mattering. It means it becomes part of your story rather than the entirety of it. You carry it. You are not carried by it. And there is one question Kübler-Ross's work points you toward directly. The hardest one in this entire video. Would the person you lost, or the life you lost, recognize your suffering as an act of love? Or would they ask you to stop? Most people already know the answer. The problem isn't ignorance, it's permission. Here is the hardest truth. Living fully is not a betrayal of what you lost. It is the only real tribute available to you. Freezing yourself at the moment of loss doesn't preserve the connection. It wastes the life that remains. And wasting it honors nothing and no one. The people Kübler-Ross watched move through grief without losing themselves didn't emerge diminished. They emerged expanded, not immediately, not without cost, but conscious grief, grief that was felt fully and moved through honestly, produced people with a different quality of presence, a seriousness about life, a refusal to waste time on what doesn't matter, not because they chose those qualities, because loss had reorganized their priorities at a level no ordinary decision could reach. That's what's waiting, not the old you, something harder to achieve and more worth having. So here is what Kübler-Ross asks of you. Not a checklist, but one concrete act. Today, find one thing you've been refusing yourself, one moment of joy, one conversation, one small return to living, that you've been withholding as proof of loyalty to your pain, and allow it. Not because the grief is over, but because the person you're becoming needs evidence that life is still possible. That is not moving on. That is moving forward, with the loss inside you, not behind you. If something in this video isn't finished yet, that feeling is correct. It isn't finished. Leave a comment with what it brought up. And when you're ready, the next video is already waiting. Not as an assignment, as a continuation of something that started in you the moment you pressed play.